Hello, everyone. This is Richard Drula, Vice President of Sales and Strategic Partnerships here at eNow Software. It's my pleasure to introduce to you Michael Van Horenbeeck. Michael's the Director of Product Research and also holds the coveted MVP MCSM status within Microsoft for the Office 365 hybrid environments. eNow Software is highly committed to the Office 365 community, and in fact is a very early adopter back in 2012 with the development of our modern analytics platform for Office 365 hybrid deployments. Our larger clients like Facebook and the City of San Francisco utilize our solution and platform to support all of their ADFS, DirSync, and various components that sit between themselves, the network, and Microsoft to ensure high availability for their clients as they continue to move into these hybrid deployments. Today, Michael's going to talk about trusting Office 365. And from an eNow software perspective, we're highly committed to the Office 365 community and ensuring high availability throughout those deployments and migrations. So with further ado, I introduce to you Michael Van Horenbeeck, who will continue on with the discussion around Office 365. Thank you very much.
Hi, and thanks for joining today. Appreciate you taking the time to be in this presentation. The question that we're going to tackle today, or at least try to tackle, is can you trust Office 365? And I know it's a loaded question, right? And there's a lot of things that we could cover. But let's start by saying what we will not cover today. So I'm not going to talk about compliance features or whether or not it's safe to store your data in the cloud and Office 365. Rather, I want to talk about Office 365 as a service. Can you trust it as a service? What is your experience going to be like? What is the uptime going to be like? Is it really, a service where you want to go to? How does it compare to your on-premises environment? That's what I want to talk about, especially because, as cloud platforms gain traction in the market, is it something for you? Can you really trust the service to be reliable in the way that you want it to be reliable? And of course, it is, it still is a very loaded question because there's a lot of things, a lot of bits and pieces that come to play to kind of try and answer that specific question. So when we look at Office 365, it is one of the fastest growing Microsoft business platforms in history of cloud services. Microsoft, I mean, it's moving forward incredibly fast. A lot of customers are onboarding. There was a recent report where they showed that Microsoft overtook Google as the number one in cloud platform for collaboration and productivity. And that's mainly because, over the past year or so, a lot of customers, took the dive into Office 365. The past few years, Microsoft has been very strong in the enterprise market, and the uptake there, or the time they take to actually move to the cloud is usually a little bit longer than the small and medium enterprises. But there's definitely a strong move forward, and Microsoft is making great progress in Office 365. I think it was at Ignite they said that over the past year they introduced about 400 updates to the service. It just kind of goes to explain how fast things are moving there and how quickly things are changing. And to that, 52% of the businesses said they will move their users to Office 365 at some point, which is, when you take a look at it, a huge amount of users worldwide, right? And I'm not here to defend whether or not it's a great idea to move to the cloud. I mean, obviously, I personally think it definitely makes a lot of sense for a lot of organizations. But it's rather interesting because, when you run a service at a scale, that brings challenges of its own, right? And not only challenges for Microsoft of running that service, which is they do a pretty good job at that. Let's face it. But it's mostly also challenges for you. I mean, if you're a small organization, then how are you going to deal with management? What are you going to do? If you're a large environment, it's sometimes it's easier to be in a large environment because some questions become a no-brainer, like directory synchronization. It's pretty much a no-brainer for large organizations to start to use that because they want to synchronize their directories. But the point is that with Office 365, with that infrastructure, with that scale, there's a lot of things that entail, what service is and how it relates to users. I mean, when you build a platform like Office 365, obviously you go through iterations after iteration of how the service evolves. But take a look at how Microsoft's um, online services evolved from BPOS to the first version of Office 365 to what it is today, and it is moving at a quick pace, and it is changing for the better, right? Newer technologies bring newer capabilities, bring better end user experience, but with growth usually comes growth pains. There is always you know things that happen, things that you cannot prevent, things that you cannot see coming, and I think Microsoft lived through some of these pains over the past years. I think customers in Office 365 have seen some of that pain. And I don't want to be inducing any fear here. Let's be quite honest about it. They do a grand job. It's just the way things are. If you run a a really large on-premises environment, things are bound to happen. Stuff breaks. I mean, that's just the nature of how things work. And I don't think that you can prevent any and all outages. That would be unreasonable to expect that. However, the perception kind of changes when you're in a cloud service model, because when you're a customer and you purchase a service from someone, then you expect that service to be at its best, right? So, of course, that's why when you purchase a service from Microsoft, when you purchase Office 365, then you have those SLAs, right? The SLAs which guarantee you that you will get a certain service level, and those SLAs are pretty tight in terms of uptime, right? When taking a look at what Microsoft has done over the past few years, there are two major outages that I can remember out of the top of my head. And of course, I'm talking about really, large scale issues here. That the most recent one was in July of 2015, where large parts of North American customers could not authenticate to Office 365. I believe I was at WPC when it happened, and of course, that gets a lot of traction. If a few large customers cannot authenticate, or if a lot of customers cannot authenticate, then the social media create a lot of fuss quite quickly, and that's kind of how I got into the outage here, because some of our customers were calling us and be like, hey, yeah, we're getting reports of outages. The dashboard is showing that there's outages. We've seen the social media streams on Twitter, talking to Office 365 and telling them, hey, you know what? It seems that we cannot authenticate. Forums, posts were brought up. It just goes a long way just to tell that when such an outage occurs, then it has a vast impact, because of course in a cloud service there is a lot of users. If you're in a internal infrastructure, so imagine you have an on-premises world, an on-premises deployment, sorry, and you're your only customer. Of course, you could have a lot of users, which in turn can generate a lot of noise, a lot of calls, a lot of problems. But basically, if there is an outage on your end, then who is impacted? That is your organization, and at worst, some organizations that rely on your infrastructure, but typically it's only your organization. When this happens to Microsoft, then it's immediately a lot of organizations that get into trouble, and as a result, if such a major outage happens, then you've got these critics that immediately complain about, oh, the cloud really isn't really good, that outage took us out for a few hours. But when you take a look at what that entails and what that outage actually means, the question remains, is it really that bad? I mean, take a look at what you see in the presentation. There's been two major outages over the past 2 years. And the July 2015 outage, it took a few hours to solve. That's true. It wasn't like the June 2014 outage where, I think it lasted about 9 hours, 6 to 9 hours. It was a really long outage. A lot of customers affected, even more as in 2015, caused a lot of negative publicity for Microsoft. But I mean, despite these outages, and that's the really interesting fact, take a look at the uptime Microsoft had over that period in time. At no point since Q4 of 2013, Microsoft dropped below 99.95% uptime. 99.95%. Now I'm willing to bet that the majority of the customers that had an outage or that are in Office 365, they would not even be able to match the 99.95% uptime over a year. That it is impossible for them, for the majority. I'm not saying it is impossible to achieve. I mean, yes, you could theoretically get to 99.99 and even more, but ask yourself, is your organization at the level that you're able to provide more uptime than Office 365 is, despite the outages? I agree. I mean, an outage, when you live through it in Office 365, especially if it's on the Office 365 end of things, is really annoying because there's nothing you can do. If the service goes down, then it's up to Microsoft to solve the problem, and you can just sit there and wait, which brings a set of challenges of its own. Because previously, especially from a management point of view, previously if there was an outage, you could go down to the IT guys and be like, you better be fixing this, and look over their shoulders and put some pressure and make sure that they're working on that right away. It's tangible. You can see people work to solve the problem. However, when you're looking at Office 365, then you don't see those people working to get your problem solved if it's on the Office 365 end. All that you can do is trust that Microsoft is, taking, is doing all that it can to get the problem solved. And believe me, if there is an outage like the June 2015 or the July 2015 outage, I'm pretty sure there's a lot of nervous people running around at Microsoft trying to get this problem solved stat. Right? I mean, that's just something you have to trust. And I mean, you can argue about it as much as you'd like, but it's not feasible to think that Microsoft just sits back and relaxes and is like, oh, right, about 15% of our customers is down. Let's just maybe take a look at it in a few minutes. No, I'm pretty sure a lot of whistles and bells and are people are frantically running around looking at what is happening. So I trust Microsoft in that regards. And for that matter, I would trust any service provider that, I purchase a service from, because basically that's why I'm paying them for. And I think that Microsoft reflects their trust in themselves to be able to handle that by having a financially backed SLA, which means that once they drop below a certain level, you can claim money back, right? So if Microsoft would really neglect outages like that, or really neglect any outage, then you'd see a lot less, a lot more downtime. You'd see these numbers drop below 99.95, way below that, and you'd see a lot of customers really complain. Of course, complaints always follow such an outage. I mean, imagine you were one of the customers living to the June 2014 outage, where you were down for 9 hours. And by down, I mean some customers were not able to send and receive messages for that period of time. Some customers, had intermittent connectivity issues, but there was a lot of, a lot of impact, right? So if you live through an entire business day of issues, especially depending on the times and where you are, then I can imagine that at the end of the day you're frustrated as hell. You're ready to complain about anything, and maybe rightfully so, right? I mean, if you haven't been able to work all day, and imagine you're in a full on-premises world, and your mail server goes down for 8 hours, well, I'm pretty sure that all the end users at the end of the day will be complaining to IT about the fact that they were not able to do what they wanted to do, which is, just the way things go, right? And that's normal. Does that actually mean that IT is doing a pretty bad job? I don't think it necessarily means. I mean, yeah, they might have had a little, hitch at that point that the outage was there. Maybe they didn't catch up on something. Maybe something happened they didn't foresee. Maybe there was a power outage that caused issues, or maybe multiple hardware failures. Whatever the issue is, I mean, it doesn't necessarily mean they did a poor job. Maybe they were faced with things they didn't see. And I believe that those challenges are exactly the same challenges that Microsoft has or any other cloud service provider has running a service at such a scale. The outcome, though, is that looking at the uptime that they still achieve, it is 99.5 at a minimum, which is, I mean, inconceivable for most organizations. And that's the point to take home, right? You know, when answering the question, can you trust Office 365, and just looking at this graph, I would just, without knowing anything more, I'd say, yeah, sure, of course. I mean, this is a pretty decent achievement, despite the two outages. Now, I don't want to, be overly positive, and I definitely don't want to be overly negative because, I tend to, to be more towards the positive side for any cloud service because it makes so much more sense. But, major outages aren't the only thing that come into play. There's also things called micro outages. And those micro outages, I believe, are more of a burden for Microsoft than the major outages. And with burden, I don't mean necessarily, bad publicity, because micro outages are outages as well. But those could be outages that affect a single customer, a few users within a single customer. I mean, running Office 365 at a scale, running Exchange at a scale. Imagine you have a large on-premises environment and a single database goes down. Well, of course, you have your database availability group to mount the database at a different server and make sure that it's still up and running. There might be a few seconds of hiccups of connectivity, if at all, but that's why you have all these safeguarding measures. But let's take a worst case scenario. You've got a batch of hard drives. Some of them go down at the same time, or maybe something unexpectedly happened. You tried moving a database, but actually the move failed, or the database dismounted. Things like that happen. It's not inconceivable. It's not unrealistic to think that some things like that don't happen. They do. So they do at Microsoft as well. I'm pretty sure they do. Well, if that happens, if a database dismounts, even if it's for a short period of time, you have a micro outage because any mailbox connected to that database will not be able to get into your mailbox or do send a message, receive a message at that point in time. If you resolve the problem within 5 to 10 minutes, then of course it was a really short micro outage, but sometimes it takes a little more time. And if you're running hundreds of thousands of servers and you've got multiple millions of mailboxes, then I'm pretty confident, and although I don't have any data, I don't think that Microsoft ever published that data. I do think that at any given time in their entire Exchange Online organization all across the world, there will probably be something going on. A database dismounted, a database maybe not replicating correctly. And some of these issues might have an end user impact, some of them might not. But, these micro outages, of course, they happen. And if you are one of the unlucky few organizations that run into a micro outage, then that is a very, unfortunate thing for you to happen. But despite all those micro outages, despite all that, it is still a very high uptime. 2 minutes of downtown connectivity, a user might just, have the tough luck that he's trying to authenticate right at the moment that his database is being moved over. Well, if he tries again in two minutes, then he might be able to connect to Outlook anyway. By the time you picked up the phone, called the help desk, Outlook starts working again, perhaps. I'm just pointing out that there's various, levels of why a service doesn't work. But more importantly, Microsoft doesn't have widespread outages that often. There are very few major outages, and I'm going to be honest here. I don't want to spread any fear because that would be unreasonable, but they've had a few major outages, and they will have a few major outages in the future. Things just happen. That's why we have insurances. That's why we need insurances for your car. You hope never to run into a car accident, but eventually you might. And likely everyone gets into some sort of car accident, and luckily the majority of them isn't really bad, but it just happens. And it's kind of Murphy's law. When things can go wrong, they will go wrong. Well, at some point they do. And to that discussion, the thing is that these little micro outages, these major outages, actually we shouldn't talk about the major outages because, once a year a major outage, it's a pain point. And I'd rather see them go away, of course, everyone does, but it is not unrealistic. And if it's once a year, I personally have not been affected by any of the two major outages that happened in Office 365. I'm running with my entire family. Okay, granted, it's only 25 mailboxes in Office 365, but still, I mean, it doesn't necessarily mean that a major outage affects all the customers. And you will notice that when you take a look at Microsoft's dashboard in Office 365, the dashboard will tell you that there is a certain amount of customers or an unknown amount of customers impacted, and sometimes it's a larger than expected amount of customers. But I have not seen a message that says all our customers were affected, because that would be a really, 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 really large outage, right? Um, and it just doesn't happen because of all the safeguard measures and the different data centers, the different regions, and how things are handled. It's more likely that you see a widespread issue like the one in July 2015, where it was basically only North America that was having an issue based on, I believe it was an update they were running out on some of their servers that caused authentication issues and so forth and so on. So they quickly rolled it back. It's very much more likely to see that have regionalized problems, and maybe have data center centric issues where a single data center is having issues, and as a result impacting some or a lot of customers. But yeah, I mean, that's the reality of things. And when we dive into this, though, and we've been focusing mostly on the outages that Microsoft has, or the outages that that occur on Office 365 side of things. I do want to point out that more than 50% of the calls that come into the Microsoft Office 365 help desk are not even Office 365 related. And that's kind of the point I want to, make today, is that yes, there are sometimes micro outages. Yes, there are sometimes outages, but most of the time, any issue with Office 365 is not Microsoft's fault. It's basically something that happens either in between their data center and your environment, or even more so in your environment. And that kind of brings up an interesting thought. And why is that? Why is that 50% of the calls come into the help desk are because of issues on the non-Microsoft side of things? Well, that's because there's a lot of components that come into play. I mean, Office 365 is Office 365, but before you, as an on-premises customer with a user sitting in your headquarters that connects to its email in Office 365 actually gets there, you go through a number of hoops. If you've got DirSync, well, there's DirSync that's there. If you've got ADFS, well, hey, ADFS is really critical at that point in time, and it is not even Microsoft's responsibility. It is your responsibility. The network on your end, any network equipment, internet connectivity that there is, that's your responsibility. The internet connection as such, that's your ISP's problem. That's their responsibility. But still, it isn't Microsoft's. So it is a shared responsibility, and it's a shared responsibility with mostly on your end. So if you have a crappy internet connection, and excuse me the words that I'm using here, but if your internet connection isn't really reliable, then that will affect your experience in Office 365, which is, I believe, the most important way of measuring cloud services. I mean, you can measure the uptime by measuring how, if you can connect to Office 365. I think from an organizational point of view, it makes much more sense. And I'm not talking about the specifics for financial, chargeback and all that, or talking about the specifics for being able to request money back if Microsoft drops below a certain SLA. I'm talking about, what makes most sense from an end user perspective, and it's their end user experience. Can an end user do what they should be able to do with the service that you bought? That is what you should focus on. You don't care about servers in Office 365. That's Microsoft's problem. But anything that affects the ability of one of your users to do what they need to do, that is what you need to monitor. That is what you need to follow up on. And that kind of brings me to, to the fact, monitoring Office 365, and let's just extend it a little bit to monitoring cloud solutions. Often when I talk to to customers, talk to people at conferences, and I talk about monitoring as a whole, they all say, yeah, sure, yeah, we do monitor our Exchange servers, disk space and resources, and DAG status and so forth and so on, which is logical because they've always done that and it's running in the data center. Yeah, yeah, sure. I mean, no one disagrees that monitoring isn't important. No one. However, when we talk about monitoring a cloud service, most of the people are saying that, well, why should we monitor a cloud service? I mean, it's no longer our problem. And they are right up until, a certain extent. They don't care about the servers, but the paradigm shifts, the mindset shifts. You don't care about the servers. At least not the service in Microsoft's data centers, but you care about the service. And what we're seeing today is that there is slowly, movement towards more and more cloud solutions or monitoring solutions that monitor cloud. But there aren't many out there because mainly it has been an afterthought, and it still is an afterthought, whereas it shouldn't be. It is important to do monitoring from an end user perspective, which basically means doing synthetic transactions. Do what a user would do and see if it works and measure that. How long did it take? Was it successful? And do that on a continuous basis so that you're sure that your users are getting the experience that they deserve. So there is that aspect of making sure that your service that you're buying is up and running. And of course, you can rely on Microsoft for doing that monitoring for you, which brings me to the service health dashboard. So Microsoft continuously monitors their own environment. Of course, they have to. And they surface that monitoring to you in the service health dashboard. But in both outages they had, or even during the micro outages, the service health dashboard isn't a real-time monitoring solution, which means that if you are faced with an outage, and I'm going to, do a little bashing here, but in the June 2014 outage, it took a few hours before the service health dashboard acknowledged there was a widespread issue, and for some customers, it gave them a few hours of uncertainty of what is happening. Is it on their end? Is it on Microsoft's end? And that's usually what ends happening. If someone calls into your help desk and tells them, hey, I'm unable to authenticate, I'm unable to do X, Y, or Z, then your first thought typically isn't Office 365 is down. No, the first thought is, okay, let's take a step back, see what's happening, can we reproduce that, and then try troubleshooting from there. But because there are so many touch points between that single user, depending on where that user is, it sometimes takes a lot of time to troubleshoot what's actually causing the issue. I mean, not being able to authenticate to Office 365 could be ADFS servers, if you're using ADFS, it could be your password synchronization, not behaving correctly on your DirSync server for all that you know. It could be an isolated user to that, isolated problem to that one user. It could be your internet connectivity into your ADFS server from that, location where the user is, or maybe it's just the internet connection of that user causing an issue. I mean, there's so many touch points, so many things to check that by the time that you've checked all that, you might realize it is an isolated issue, or you might realize, hey, this could be a more widespread issue, which then brings you to the point, hey, we need more input. We need to know for sure. And maybe you get that input by the number of calls that are being done to your help desk, because if it's a widespread issue, then you can be pretty sure that a lot of people will be calling into your help desk and let you know, hey, it's down. But it all goes to the fact that it takes time to troubleshoot an issue, time that you otherwise wouldn't always be spending in a purely on-premises world because you have better monitoring. You do a lot of monitoring on a lot of endpoints. You might immediately be able to determine, hey, there is a switch down. So it's not because you're moving to the cloud that you shouldn't be doing those things anymore. I think you definitely should. If you don't have them today, then you should be looking at doing it, making sure that your network connectivity to Office 365 is monitored properly, but also that functionality, whether it is provided by Microsoft or by your own on-premises servers, are being monitored correctly as well. And that kind of brings me to the challenges of cloud solutions. In this case, more specifically, Office 365. The challenge that you see when you're running in Office 365, when you're running such a service, and not running the service, when you're using the service is a better way of putting it, then if if you're new to Office 365, there is a learning curve, which means that if you've never dealt with ADFS, if you've never dealt with DirSync, hybrid deployment maybe, then that's all new. New things, you need your time to wrap your head around it, make sure that you understand how it works, how it can break, and how to troubleshoot things. You might not always have the same set of tools available to, know what is happening, especially, you don't get log files from an Office 365 server that gives you visibility into the client connectivity problems. Um, and there might be additional components on the hybrid side of things. As I said earlier, ADFS, DirSync, but even within Exchange, hybrid configurations are different than a purely on-premises configuration. Permissions, if you're moving mailboxes, who has access to whose mailbox, because if you move the wrong mailboxes at the wrong time, some people might not be able to access the other mailbox, especially in case you've got a CEO and their management assistant. Typically you want to move those mailboxes at the same time, but because it's new, you might not know, or at least, I mean, you need to get some sort of visibility into what's happening in your environment to understand what you can do in Office 365 or how you should tackle certain things. And then there is the ongoing maintenance. I mean, updates. There is a incredible, speed of updates in Office 365. The cadence at which updates get spawned upon you is incredible. Daily, weekly, monthly, quarterly updates. It's all coming down to you, in addition of anything that you need to maintain on premises. Again, the reason why I'm hitting this point very hard is because it is very important to understand that whatever you do, whatever deployment type you choose for Office 365, there is always a responsibility on your end. And it doesn't always extend, or it doesn't only extend to your infrastructural components like ADFS, DirSync, and so forth and so on. It also extends to your users. I mean, as technology moves forward, as we move along the timeline, then certain technologies are no longer supported. I mean, there are organizations using Windows XP still today. They shouldn't be using it with Office 365. It's not officially supported, and it likely wouldn't work. And it's not unthinkable at some point in time that Office 2010, which you might be using today, won't be supported anymore. And at some point in the future, the same will happen with Office 2013 and so forth and so on. Of course, some of these deadlines are way ahead of us, right? Not something you have to worry about right now, but for some, these deadlines are realistic. Some of these deadlines are here today, especially the example I used for Windows XP. And I mean, those are things that as an organization you need to be aware of, that you need to keep in mind, right? Those have an impact. Those is a challenge for some organizations on how to keep up with all those updates. And luckily, there are a lot of solutions around that. I mean, updates for your clients, instead of updating and pushing out your clients' updates for Office, you could go for the click to run installation from Microsoft, which is self-updating, self-maintaining, and that has a lot of advantages there. But at the other hand, you might not be able to do so, and there are some drawbacks. I mean, it's different for every organization. You have to do your due diligence and pick your battle, right? But every choice um, has its own intricacies, I'd say. Single sign-on, hitting that point again, is difficult. I mean, if you aren't familiar with ADFS, setting up an ADFS server isn't difficult, but if you aren't familiar with the flow, how it works, how to troubleshoot it, well, the first time you're hit with an ADFS issue, I can tell you it's scary. I mean, it's not easy to troubleshoot. You might need tools like Fiddler to figure out what's happening on your end and why it is breaking. And there's so many things that could break that, sometimes it's better to get help to make sure that you know all that. And then, of course, there's the cloud things as well, things that only happen in the cloud, managing licenses, making sure you've got sufficient licenses, that everyone has a license. And, usually on premises, you've got a pretty good idea of how many users use what application. But when you're in Office 365, I think it's really important as an organization that you understand how the servers that you bought is being used. Imagine, and this I think is a really good example, that your organization decided to purchase Exchange, or actually Office 365 E3 licenses for all of your users. Well, that's great. They get, SharePoint link, Skype, sorry, Exchange, and all sorts of other goodies. But Do you really need those E3 licenses? And I'm not saying you don't, but how do you know that you need them or don't need them? Well, you have to track down usage. Are your users actually using SharePoint as heavily as you think they are? Is everyone using Skype? Um, is everyone using their mailbox? Chances are for the latter, the answer is pretty much yes, because if you don't have an alternative, well, it's very hard to send and receive messages if you don't use your mailbox, right? But often we see that a lot of organizations, come to the conclusions that an E3 license for everyone might not just be what they're looking for. Maybe they'll find out that the majority of their users are actually not using Outlook, but are using Outlook web app. Well, that might be a trigger for them to replace some E3 licenses with a kiosk license. But the way to do that is tracking those usage statistics using reporting capabilities in Office 365, making sure that you take the data, report on the data, maybe on a weekly basis, on a daily basis. It really depends on the organization, but you need to gain visibility into what's happening in Office 365. And that's really a key point. So, what is the answer to trusting Office 365? Is it trustworthy? I would say yes. The answer here is definitely yes. But trust is good, control is better. And I'm not saying that you have to be paranoid, right? I mean, you just have to make sure that you cover your bases. Make sure that you know what you want to know about the service and that you get what you need. And I'm pretty sure that for some organizations today, the tools that are available in Office 365 offer everything they need in order to get that visibility. But to be honest, for a lot of organizations, it isn't. The reporting capabilities in Office 365 are limited. The monitoring capabilities are limited because it's not a real-time dashboard. It doesn't tell you where the issue is, and it certainly will not start alerting you if your ADFS server is down. That's only something you can do if you monitor those ADFS servers. And of course, you can monitor a server by monitoring whether the server is up and whether it has enough resources, but that doesn't tell you whether or not your ADFS server is handing out tokens to your users that they can use to authenticate to Office 365. Monitoring the uptime of your dersing server doesn't tell you whether it's successfully synchronizing objects to Office 365. Luckily, if it's not synchronizing at all, Microsoft will send you an email telling you that they didn't get a synchronization attempt in the last 24 hours. But, before that email gets to you, it's been 24 hours. Just to give you an example here, why monitoring dersync is really important. Um, and dersync isn't critical. Well, it is, and it isn't. um, if you have dersync enabled, then it synchronizes every 3 hours. So imagine you do a synchronization in dersync, and then you wait, and then the server goes down. It goes down for an hour, comes back up. You're fine because it wouldn't have synchronized otherwise, and it doesn't generate an impact. Now, imagine the same scenario: you synchronize, and then the dersync server goes down. Obviously, you do not expect any change you make to be up and available in Office 365 within the next 3 hours. So let's say that you just created a user while the dersync server was down and you did not monitor the dersync server. And by the dersync server being down, I don't mean the physical or the virtual server. I mean the services. It is not synchronizing as it should. Whatever the issue is, it's not doing what it should do. So you create a user and, you know that it takes a while before that user is created in Office 365, so you continue doing your work, and then after a few hours, and this happened to one of our current customers, is after a few hours, and actually it was the day after, the HR department came down to IT and said, well, we asked you to create that user, and he's not able to authenticate. Just came over to us. We tried accessing his mailbox, or I can't remember what it was, and as it turned out, the user wasn't in Office 365. So, the IT department started investigating, and okay, well, it was kind of logical. Hey, you know what? We created a user. It isn't in Office 365. Let's find out what happens. So they go to the dersync server, and the dersync server is down. Or, the services are down, or there's an issue with it. Well, at that point, they need to start troubleshooting. But the issue already, was created 24 hours ago. So you have an extended outage, and now the outage takes more time because you only found out after so much time. Of course, if you checked up, or if you check up manually every 3 hours, if DirSync is working, you're good. But no one does that. I mean, it just takes too much time. So you need to have something that follows up for you, that monitors that, and preferably does that with a synthetic transaction, and takes a look at the DirSync run history and gives you back that information proactively, so that if there is an issue, you can actually go in immediately. Now, DirSync is not, or AD Sync, AD Connect, whatever tool you're using, I'm just talking about directory synchronization here, is not critical if you're just use DirSync. But it becomes much more important when you have password synchronization enabled. So imagine you're an organization that relies on password synchronization, and the DirSync server goes down. Server goes down, services go down, whatever happens. That's not critical. Well, until someone changes his password, because you would expect that if someone changes his password, that password gets synced up to Office 365 and they can log in into Office 365 with a new password. Well, if that server is down and password synchronization is enabled, it won't. Even more so, the password synchronization is not stored, is not queued, it is lost. So you change the on-premises password, it get not synchronized to Office 365, and now you have an inconsistency because the password in Office 365 is still the old password, whereas the user thinks he changed his password on premises, and as a result, it also changed in Office 365. So guess what happens? They could go to Office 365, try logging in with a new password. They get a password is incorrect prompt. Well, of course they think they mistyped it, so they try again and again and again and again. And after a while, they get locked out maybe. They call to the help desk and they're like, hey, this is causing issues. In a small environment with 10, 20 people, of course, there's only 20 people that can call into the help desk if you have a help desk guy. But if you're in a large organization, multiple password resets can happen a day, resulting in an additional burden on your organization. Is that really something you want to be dealing with? And at the time that it is being dealt with, how long has it been down for? Did everyone call into the help desk? Maybe some users figured out that they still need to use their old password in Office 365, and now they start using the old password along with the new password without even ever telling the help desk, until they then change their password in the future after you solve the problem, only to find out that their password also changed in Office 365, which causes a lot of confusion. So that's why that functionality becomes really important. And I've beaten the topic of ADFS to death already, but that's of course important as well. And those are things in your control. Those are things on your end that you need to monitor. Same goes for the network connectivity, as I mentioned earlier. But how do you measure, or how do you check functionality in Exchange Online? Well, basically, it all comes down to active monitoring. It also comes down um, to synthetic transactions. So it is very important that you understand why a problem is occurring, when it is occurring, and where it is occurring. So what our solution, MAILSCAPE 365, does is we cover all the topics that I just talked about. We cover all the hybrid bits and pieces: DirSync, ADFS, AAD sync, password synchronization, network connectivity, but also Exchange Online functionality, mail flow test. So the June 2014 outage, for instance, or July 2015 outage, our customers, because we do these continuous synthetic transactions, and some of them are as simple as sending a message back and forth between a recipient in Office 365 and an external recipient, but because you're testing the functionality, you get alerted immediately if the functionality is down. And you not only get informed if there is a major outage, but if there is an outage that only affects your organization, you get notified as well, because those micro outages, because those synthetic transactions, they are being done using your user accounts in your environment. And as a result, it is scoped to what you can see. It is near real-time monitoring of your functionality. And again, I agree that chances that the functionality in Exchange Online show up as a critical alert are very slim, because there aren't a lot of Office 365 outages and micro outages or major outages, but they happen. And if they happen, you want to know that they happen, and you want to know where they happen. Because if they happen in Office 365, the way you tackle the problem is completely different than the way you tackle the problem when it is on premises. If one of your servers is down and causes an outage, then your IT team goes out and solve the problem on their servers. However, if there is an outage in Office 365 and there's nothing you can do about it, you stop trying to solve the problem and you start managing the problem. You communicate to your users, and if email is down, you'll have to find another way of communicating to them, but at least you're proactive about it. You can tell your management, hey, you know what, we have an issue, there's nothing we can do about it to actually get it solved more quickly, but at least you can communicate, manage the outage, make sure everyone knows what's there, and then have a better end user experience from that point of view. Knowing what's happening and informing people is better than just telling them, I don't know. That's the worst answer anyone could give when you're queried about what's happening. I don't know. It's not really a pretty situation to be in. So you want to make sure that you get that visibility both from a functionality point of view and from using or a usability point of view, which brings me to the reporting side of things. You need to have a solution that pulls in the data that is available in Office 365, makes it available to you as a report on a daily basis, which we do for you as well. So just remember that cloud platforms are enormously flexible and powerful, right? But despite the great uptime, and I cannot stress it enough, Office 365 has a great uptime, things break. They break more on your end than they do on Microsoft's end, but they do break eventually on either end. So monitoring really isn't an afterthought or isn't something you could treat as an afterthought. Monitoring your environment, your hybrid environment, your on-premises environment, if you're full cloud, is as important as if you were hosting those services on premises. And even, when it comes to functionality, I believe, and I'm pretty sure, that monitoring the service in Office 365 is as important as well. Because of that visibility, because you monitor the end user experience, you safeguard that end user experience, your end users are more happy. Happy end users means happy management. Happy management means you're happy too, because, they'll be happy towards you. And it eliminates some fear associated with moving to the cloud, because the number one thing I hear from people moving to Office 365 is they have no clue what's happening. They have a fear of the unknown. They have a fear of the black box. Well, to take away that fear, just make sure that you can look inside the black box, that it's no longer a black box. And then, of course, that fear will go away, will melt away pretty quickly. So this being said, I hope you enjoyed this presentation. Feel free to ask your questions, and thanks for being here today. I enjoyed it too. Thank you.
Thank you for attending the webinar, Can You Trust Office 365? If you are thinking about Office 365 or are already in the cloud, try MAILSCAPE 365 for enhanced visibility into your environments. Follow the special URL listed on this page and try MAILSCAPE for free for 30 days and also receive a $50 Amazon gift card. Thanks for joining.